we could blame his internet provider and name it, but maybe we can refrain from doing that for now. So he sent me his opening remarks and requested that I read it to all of you. Okay, so here we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're very glad to see all of you here. I understand we've had about almost 200 people register for this event, and we're greatly heartened to see everyone's interest and enthusiasm for this very important and very relevant discussion on health and the environment. This webinar is the latest of a series of fora on climate change and biodiversity that the Institute of International Legal Studies has been organizing in partnership with Bukas since last year. This is the third legal forum of its kind. Our first event actually highlighted recent scientific reports released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which all clearly state that human actions have severely altered the climate system. These changes have led to sharp declines in the extent and quality of ecosystems and serious risks to human lives and well-being. We also emphasized that large-scale systemic changes are needed to slow, halt, or reverse these impacts. The forum created a venue for the discussion of policy responses to the latest climate science on climate change, providing opportunities for the identification of cross-cutting issues and interests and possible areas for collaboration. Our second forum took place alongside the Stetson International Environmental Moot Court Competition's Southeast Asian Rounds, which the UP College of Law hosted very early this year, and incidentally, will once again host early next year, although this time online. It examined the role of policy and cooperative action in relation to vulnerable terrestrial and marine ecosystems, such as wetlands, mangrove forests, and seagrass areas, which provide valuable ecosystem services, but usually receive less attention, investments, and resources. This forum takes off from the interest generated by the previous fora. We had initially planned for it to take place in April, but as I'm sure everybody here knows, this year is not going according to plan. So this year was, in fact, originally dubbed a super year for nature and biodiversity, with critical international meetings on biodiversity and climate change scheduled to take place. With the Paris Agreement set to come into effect and preparations underway for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, new ambitious and transformative goals and targets to slow the climate breakdown and preserve and restore the world's biodiversity and ecosystems were meant to be adopted this year. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, these have all been moved to next year. As efforts towards global policymaking are inevitably affected and delayed, so will their implementation and translation into nationally appropriate policies and programs. Despite delays in addressing climate change and biodiversity at the global stage, however, the COVID-19 pandemic actually places in stark focus the interconnections between humans and the natural world. It highlights how vital biodiversity is to systems that support human life and health, and underscores the critical need to effectively craft and implement forward-looking international and domestic environmental policies even as the world slowly recovers from the effects of this global pandemic. We truly hope that today's forum serves as a space for all of us to discuss and learn more about the complex linkages between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and public health in the context of COVID-19, as well as the implications of recent developments on relevant multilateral environmental agreements. We are very grateful to our speakers, Dr. Monica Ortiz, Dr. Aldrin Mallari, Mr. Mon San Pascual, and Attorney Theresa Tenazas, as well as our facilitator, Attorney Alexandra Gamboa, for joining us this afternoon and for their willingness to share their time and expertise with all of us. To our facilitator, our speakers, and all our participants, we welcome you once again and look forward to a fruitful afternoon for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Niner. As mentioned, I am Attorney Alexandra Gamboa, and I will be your moderator for today. I am an environmental lawyer and a public policy specialist and the law professor, and I am currently the manager of government initiatives for RARE's branch office in the Philippines. My work allows me to engage with national and subnational government agencies as well as global institutions to create an enabling policy environment for the Philippines to promote and support sustainable behavior. With that, I would just like to stress the point that Attorney Niner just said that 2020 was really anticipated as a super year for nature. For a number of multilateral agreements were supposed to come into fruition, and we're supposed to set ambitious and transformative goals. This year has also been seen as our last best chance to save the planet. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, the question is, where are we now and how is this work being taken forward? And this webinar is meant to serve as a forum for exactly that, to bring together practitioners, stakeholders, and students from diverse fields for both people and planet. It seeks to provide a venue to discuss the linkage between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and public health in the context of this global pandemic, and as well as the role of international and national policy as the world moves towards recovery and long-term resilience. This webinar also aims to assess the status and implications of multilateral environmental agreements on biodiversity and the environment in the Philippines during this COVID-19 pandemic, as well as to highlight the importance of strengthening collaboration of the health and environment sector in mainstreaming biodiversity and health linkages in national and local policies, plans, and programs, and in our reporting instruments. I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker, Dr. Monica Ortiz, is an interdisciplinary researcher who focuses on climate change, food security, and biodiversity. She finished her doctorate on climate and crop modeling at the University of Sheffield. Before her PhD, she worked with the Manila Observatory and the Ateneo School of Government on science policy, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. She is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University College of London, investigating the impacts of agricultural production and trade on global biodiversity. Our next speaker is Mr. Neil Aldrin Mallari. He is a National Geographic explorer and a biodiversity conservation practitioner and advocate. He is the founder of a number of biodiversity conservation non-governmental organizations in the Philippines, including the Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines and Center of Conservation Innovations Philippines, where he is the president and the lead scientist. As a seasoned conservationist, he has led program development and directed various programs, projects, and activities in the Philippines designed to implement and promote biodiversity conservation, improve protected areas management, climate change adaptation and mitigation, habitat restoration, strategic planning, and organization development. He has had extensive experience in working with different government agencies, funding agencies, development partners, and the private sector, and has influenced important conservation policies and investment portfolios for biodiversity conservation. Currently, he is also an ecology professor at the De La Salle University and Far Eastern University in the Philippines, where he focuses on strengthening conservation science and conservation capacities of future conservation leaders to improve conservation practice. Our third speaker for today is Mr. Ramon San Pascual. Mr. Ramon San Pascual has a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Washington in Seattle, the same university where he served as a Gates Packard Fellow for the Population Leadership Program in 2004. He currently serves as the Executive Director of Healthcare Without Harm Asia, an international non-government organization that seeks to transform healthcare worldwide so that it reduces its environmental footprint, becomes a community anchor for sustainability, and a leader in the global movement for environmental health and justice. And for our last speaker today, Ms. Attorney Theresa Tenazas currently serves as the OIC Chief of the Wildlife Resources Division, of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources Biodiversity Management Bureau. As part of the DENR BMB, she advocates for the enforcement of laws related to the trade of wildlife. Wildlife plays an important role in balancing the environment. Hence, the need to properly conserve, manage, and protect their population in the wild, Attorney Theresa says. That's why DNR strictly enforces the wildlife law to regulate the collection and trade of wildlife. She urges everyone to say no to illegal wildlife trade and say yes to a healthy and resilient biodiversity. So those are our esteemed speakers for today. And for our first presenter, we will be hearing from Dr. Andrea Ortiz on the impacts of COVID-19 on UN climate change and biodiversity processes. Dr. Andrea, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, sorry. I hope that you can see my screen. Is that fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Ortiz. I'm based at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources here in London. I'm very thankful for the invitation to talk about the implications of COVID-19 on progress in the UN Conventions on Biodiversity and Climate Change. You can find my contact information here on the screen, and if you're interested about the larger project on the interactions between agriculture, trade, and biodiversity, do check out our work, biotaucl.org. So today, we'll be talking about COVID-19 as just the tip of the iceberg of a complex set of environmental challenges, and highlight the connections between biodiversity loss, climate change, and zoonotic diseases, and emphasize the role of policy in that context. We'll look at some of the environmental responses to COVID-19 so far and highlight opportunities for policy within global policies, but also just overall, how can we respond to COVID-19, thinking about biodiversity and thinking about climate change. My presentation here today is based off of a paper that I've written with Aya De Leon, Nicole Torres, Nainer Diao, and Tony Lavinia. It's available as a preprint, which means that we're very, very welcome to receive your feedback and comments, and look forward to hopefully receiving some after this talk. Okay, so I'll get started. Yes. So as it has been mentioned already, 2020 was supposed to be a super year for the environment. I know 2020 hasn't ended yet, and it feels like we've been in 2020 for 2,000 years. But 2020 had a lot of hopes pinned upon it. This is because key moments were due to take place that would be very important points for setting the environmental agenda for decades to come. As it has been mentioned, the draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the second round of what countries are willing to commit to mitigate climate emissions were due to be submitted this year. However, because of COVID-19, these conferences have been postponed. What would have been the Conference of the Parties in Kunming, China, and the COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland have been postponed. They will now be taking place in May and November of next year. So more than the policy delays that COVID-19 has caused, it has given us a chance to reflect and really say, where do we stand with the environment and major global policies? A number of important reports have been released in the past year, including the IPES report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which found that without transformative change, we are going to lose around 1 million species to extinction. It also finds that we are not going to meet the previous biodiversity targets that we have set for ourselves. And not meeting these targets means that we are undermining our efforts to meet our other goals, including for climate change, including for sustainable development. Another report released last year was the IPCC Climate Change and Land Report, and it says that we are seriously compromising the health of our land systems through human activities such as agriculture and forestry. While these are important activities that have supported our growing global population, it has come at the expense of ecosystems and biodiversity. Scientific assessments of the pledges to reduce emissions show that we're not going to meet the below 2 degrees Celsius target even if most of them are implemented well. This means that emission pledges, these NDCs, are seriously lacking. We're due to see about 3 degrees Celsius of warming. And this is why there were very high expectations for 2020 to be this super year, to be this change, this chance to pivot and decide how environmental policy will look like for the coming decades. But obviously, COVID-19 has thrown a sledgehammer, and we're just starting to see what those effects might be. So this is what we wanted to investigate in our paper. So there's a lot at stake and on the table and within brackets for biodiversity and climate change. Because of the COVID-19 crisis and the economic recession that we are experiencing and we will continue to experience for a number of years, there is a great risk that nations become inward-looking and say, well, you know, the environment is important, but the economy is also very important, and people are unemployed, health systems are suffering, and already there have been very many bailouts and rescue missions for fossil fuel industries, including aviation. But what we want to emphasize, or what I want to emphasize in this talk, is to remember that COVID-19 is an environmental problem in itself. It's a manifestation of our relationship with wildlife and how we interact with wildlife. So the responses that we have to COVID-19 are intricately linked to how we respond to the economic crisis, how we respond to climate change, and how we respond to biodiversity loss. So this current pause in global policymaking leaves us a lot of uncertainty. So it'll be very interesting to see how we move forward from here. So that's what we tried to investigate, and we'll go through a bit today. The main drivers of zoonotic disease transmission, this is from a UN Environment Program and International Livestock Research Institute report released in the middle of the pandemic, are that there are 7 main drivers of zoonotic disease transmission. We are demanding more meat for consumption. We are using agriculture or doing agriculture in an unsustainable way. We are increasing our use and exploitation of wildlife. We are using natural resources unsustainably. We have increased travel and transportation, leading to more emissions and leading to more instances of transmission. We have changes in our food supply. For example, you might have a product that has 20 ingredients, and those 20 ingredients come from 20 different countries. And there are lots of points of transmission, lots of points of infection within those food chains. And lastly, climate change, which will complicate everything, as we know, because it will change the range and distribution and abundance of pathogens, their vectors, host species, and other wildlife. And when we look at the main drivers of biodiversity loss, I think Dr. Mallari will talk about this in his presentation. There are 5: changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasion of alien species. Hindi literal na alien, just invasive species. That's what that means. And so when we put these side by side, the drivers of biodiversity loss and the drivers of zoonotic disease transmission, we see that they are identical, if not very, very closely linked together. So in Spider-Man meme speak, ay, ikaw rin pala yan. So it's very, very closely linked together. And what we wanted to do was map those interactions and say, well, here's the chain of interconnections between these drivers. This is quite a complex figure, but it's not even close to what the real complexity of our interactions with the environment is. But if you can follow on my screen, for example, it has been shown that increases in income lead to demand for more meat. And that meat can come from livestock, that meat can come from wild animals, but that increases the opportunity for zoonotic disease transmission. Increases in income are also linked to more travel and transport, more trade, which lead to more emissions. And more emissions lead to more climate change. And this changes distribution of pathogens, vectors, releases pathogens from the permafrost, leading to more opportunities. But what we really wanted to highlight in this chain of interconnections is the role of policy, and emphasize that policy has an important mitigating, regulating, and even preventative role within this chain of connections. When you have more effectively protected species, you have more protected areas, you have more effective restoration initiatives, and actually meet the emission targets that we set, then you have opportunities to reduce zoonotic disease transmission and also address the drivers of biodiversity loss. The key word here obviously is effective. So where have we gotten so far? What have been some of the environmental responses to COVID-19 so far? We know that there have been decreases to emissions, although this is somewhat inadvertent due to lockdowns and travel restrictions. We've seen many reports of rewilding of areas. Some of them are real, some of them are not. But definitely there's increased attention and awareness of the wildlife trade, the connections between wildlife trade and pandemics such as COVID-19. And indeed, there have been wildlife bans in parts of Asia, notably China and Vietnam, but we'll go back to this a little bit later. Some of the negative environmental responses to COVID-19 have been, as I mentioned, bailouts for airlines and fossil fuel industries. Some exploratory initiatives in Australia have been released from moratorium during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a loss of visible collective action from the Greta effect of 2019 Fridays for Future. There's conflicting advice. You should be concerned for your own health and safety, but this has promoted the use of private vehicle transport, also due to the loss of alternatives and public transport. And this has resulted that these emissions have climbed back up again. And of course, the big pollution problem, including plastic pollution from PPE, such as masks and gloves. So what does this mean for COP15 for biodiversity and COP26 for climate change? Will this COVID-19 pandemic mean that governments will say, yes, this is our moment, we can change our systems and become more forward-thinking for biodiversity and for climate? It could also have the completely opposite effect and say, well, you know, I have to focus on my own economy rather than focusing on the global kind of situation, global environmental policy. And the governments are under increased pressure and scrutiny to recover from COVID-19. But could this happen at the expense of the environment? But we need to recognize that these interconnections exist and reflect that in global policy to not waste the opportunities presented by COVID-19. A good question is, have we been here before? History repeats itself, and though we haven't seen a pandemic of this scale, at least in our lifetimes, we have seen international negotiations take place after major economic recessions. And unfortunately, their outcomes have not been very good. For example, COP15 in Copenhagen, a very famous failure of climate policy negotiations, came after the financial recession. There were high trade tensions between China and the US. There was a change in leadership in the US. Sounds familiar, right? The financial crisis also made the green agenda very unpopular in Europe, such that it was scrapped from a lot of campaigns after the financial recession. So this perceived conflict between economics and the environment will definitely manifest itself as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And it might reflect itself within the way that nations negotiate for global environmental policy. So in light of that, we highlighted opportunities in our paper to take the chance that the COVID-19 has presented. This includes better communication across conventions between the Biodiversity and Climate Change conventions, even the Desertification Convention. We need to recognize how complex our food systems have become and transform agricultural systems and take stock of where we are in our planning for implementing them within policies. We need to think about nature-based solutions and possibly partnering with the private sector to implement them. We need to demand greater ambition for biodiversity targets and for the second round of submission of NDCs. We need to rethink business as usual, and we need to stop funding and rescuing the fossil fuel industry. Those are some very key opportunities that we can take on during and after the pandemic. But I wanted to emphasize that nuanced views are needed. For example, going back to the wildlife bans in China and Asia, wildlife serves a purpose. It serves meat, it serves the nutrition needs of many communities. It has a traditional role in many indigenous communities. And there's also the threat that we're blaming a lot of countries when given the fact that a lot of Western countries, a lot of industrialized countries, routinely outsource their biodiversity threats to Asia and Africa. For example, food supply for many of these countries are grown outside industrialized countries and simply exported back. So the calls of the world to say, "Uy, tama na yan, let's stop the wildlife trade." Of course, that's very much welcome, but it needs to come with nuance, and it needs to come with a recognition of the needs of communities, and that we can't just stop it right now, just like that, and what will happen to the wildlife that's already in cultivation. So it needs to be balanced. There also needs to be accountability to nature-based solutions. If fossil fuel industries were the main funders of nature-based solutions, is that something that we are comfortable with? So there need to be safeguards for the implementation of initiatives like this. And importantly, we need to consider the voices of those who are most vulnerable to health and climate crisis while we recover from COVID-19. So in conclusion, the delays to policymaking caused by COVID-19 are both good and bad. Good in the sense that, hey, this is our moment to actually take stock of where we are and transform our policies and transform our systems to reflect those interconnections between economics, between biodiversity, between climate change, and between society. However, it's also has negative consequences. This moment to absorb losses from the economic recession will inadvertently, or for sure, divert resources that would have been for the environment and divert energy and divert priority towards other goals apart from the environment. So there's still a chance to forge a better normal, but it's a very challenging road ahead. We can't solve everything with good policy. Obviously, it's an enabling environment. So it's a very important step, and hopefully we can get it right. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Andrea, for providing the context of why we are here today, to emphasize that there really is a very close linkage between biodiversity, climate change, and health, and for discussing why our relationship with the environment should be an important consideration, even when we talk about recovery and response plans to a health pandemic. As Dr. Andrea mentioned, kung sa Spider-Man meme pa, pag nagkita yung responses to environment and health, sasabihin din nila, ay, ikaw pa rin pala yan. So, a few notes for our participants before we proceed. You may send your questions to the chat box on Zoom. If you have any, please address them to Ms. Nicole Torres, as she will be consolidating the questions today. The organizers will also be sending a Google form link near the end of this webinar for those who would like certificates of attendance. So for our next speaker, we have Dr. Neil Aldrin Mallari to discuss the interconnections between biodiversity and human health as identified by scientific studies and the global assessment of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Dr. Neil, please go ahead.
Thanks, Atty. Alex. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Can we ask? Yan. I'll probably turn off my video and then I'll ask the organizer to play my PowerPoint. That's okay.
All right po, sir.
Right. Again, good afternoon, friends and colleagues. It's an honor and privilege to be given a chance to speak to you all, and many thanks to the Institute of International Legal Studies of UP and Para Bukas for inviting us. Today, I will try to be a mouthpiece of a sector that has always been underrepresented in many spaces in the realm of governance and management. Next, please. The focus of my talk today will be on biodiversity and natural capital and other terms associated with them. I'll try to show the nexus of the natural capital to human health. There's now a growing number of papers, journal articles, opinion columns, and rhetoric around nature-based solutions and how nurturing nature can be the way forward in this new normal. We always see this kind of surge of public clamor after each ecological disaster, resulting in a loss of lives and livelihood. Remember Ormoc, Ondoy, Tisoy, Lawin, Taal eruption, and the list goes on. As a response, government, private sector, civil society are called to arms. Everybody seemed to heed the call. After a bit, energies fizzle out. Then we all go back to business as usual until another disaster comes along. And this time we have COVID-19 pandemic. I hope this time around, we will all spin out of this vicious cycle. Next, please. I was tasked to show the causal links between biodiversity and human health. And from our lens, we think these two are inseparable. I concur and agree with the global call of this Planetary Health Alliance group for a paradigm shift to expand the concept of human health to include that planetary health. Next, please. And the links have been established very vividly, as you can see in this diagram, which was published in the Lancet. If our household is, or house is not safe, unkept, unstable, our health will also be compromised. Next, please. And in order for us to remain healthy, in the long term, we need to have a healthy planet. And I agree with that. Next, please. It's almost a cliche to begin with a statement that the Philippines is a mega diversity country, but I had to do it anyway. Mega diversity countries is a term used to refer to the world's top biodiversity rich countries in the world. And biodiversity is by no means evenly distributed in our planet, and some countries like the Philippines, especially in the tropics, harbor far greater concentrations of biodiversity than any other country in the world. As you can see, Philippines is very kulangot lang ng ibang countries. Next slide, please. As you can see in this table, the Philippines is such an important country globally because of its exceptional levels of narrow endemism, both from the terrestrial and the marine. In fact, as you can see, there is a 61% overall endemism for terrestrial vertebrates alone. Or simply put, it's 6 out of 10 animals that you see in the Philippines are found only here and nowhere else. In comparison, Spain is twice larger, 2 times bigger than the Philippines, but we have 10 times more endemic species than they have. Brazil, or famous for the Amazon forest, is 28 times bigger than the Philippines. But we have twice as many endemic species here. Next slide, please. Apologies for the shameless plug. I just would like to underscore here, the rate of discovery in the Philippines is also amazing, despite the devastation. Even as we speak, a new species is being discovered or getting closer to extinction before we get to know them. This is a frog species that we discovered, newly described, hot off the press this week. So this frog in the cloud forest of Samar and Leyte. Next, please. When we talk about biodiversity, biodiversity to us is the building blocks of our ecosystems. Ecosystems are essential to mankind because these provide food and water, they clean our air, regulate climate, and protect us from natural hazards. These building blocks of ecosystems are under threat from massive habitat loss and degradation. to us, they are the first line of defense. So they need to be protected at all costs. Our survival or their survival means that we will survive. Or, you know, if they are still in danger, their survival is at risk. Our lives are on the line too. Next, please. This is a visual representation of the cycle of degradation of ecosystems. We know this from our elementary biology and ecology, but often people who create those policies seem to have forgotten this golden rule, if you like. Next, please. The time and the cost to repair will depend on the intensity of the disturbance and the severity of the damage. The first warning, as you can see that here, is that when we cross the transition threshold controlled by biotic interactions, for example, if we lose trees, we lose vegetation in our riverine system, we lose corals, seagrasses, we lose vegetative cover. If we cross that threshold, the primary processes will still be functional, but the recovery will require a lot of vegetation manipulation. The second sort of warning is when we cross the transition threshold controlled by abiotic limitations. For example, when soil erosion happens, we lose the water holding capacity of the land or the soil. And once we cross that threshold, it will take a long time to recover. And so planting trees and not matching the species with the successional stage will not guarantee that we will recover. Next, please. Roughly 2 out of 3 hectares in the Philippines is hilly or mountainous. So anything below these hilly areas are valleys and act as natural basins, as you can see here. Metro Manila, Central Luzon, etc. Almost all of the major urban centers are situated in these natural basins. Imagine these mountains losing forest cover. What do you think will be the impact of, say, 2 meters of rain happening in just 1 or 2 days or in a few hours? Where will all this water go? Next slide, please. Perhaps a reminder, and I hope you still remember, but we Filipinos are notorious for having like a dory memory, short-term memory. I hope we remember Ondoy. Often we tend to forget that all of these extreme weather events have paralyzed the economy in recent years. Next, please. And the economic costs are staggering. Lives and livelihoods were lost. I hope you still remember these photos. Next, please. I'd like to show you now some analysis that we've done in Upper Marikina River Basin Protected Landscape and the Kaliwa Watershed Forest Reserve. We've analyzed satellite images between 2001 to 2014. Next, please. The green areas are forests, while the gray areas there are non-forest areas. I think you can recognize where you are: San Mateo, Marikina, Cainta, Tagaytay, Taytay, Antipolo, etc. The red blobs or shaded areas are recently deforested areas. And the dotted lines represent the boundaries of the protected areas, the one in red, purple, and one in light blue. Next, please. These twin protected areas since the 1990s have had a steady decline of forest cover, as you can see. The downhill trend of forest cover has an inverse relationship with human population, as you can see there, the blue line. Our modeling predicted a tipping point happening thereabouts around 2009, or give and take two years. We warned that beyond this tipping point, the landscape cannot and will not be able to sustain life in the long term. because there is a super competition for space happening in these areas because of the burgeoning population. You can see how rapid the population growth is. But no one listened. And then boom, Ondoy happened in 2010. Next slide, please. If you look at the other side of the twin, deforestation rate is the same in this Kaliwa watershed, but not as severe as the Upper Marikina watershed. But still, this is a worrying downhill trend. After Ondoy, the Philippine Disaster Resilience and Now Response Foundation rallied the like-minded private sector players to respond. Everyone from SM to Jollibee to Accenture, Ayala Group, the MVP Group, Smart, PLDT, etc., even Coca-Cola, to name a few, together with DNR, fired on all cylinders to rehab Upper Marikina watershed. And you can see there, the green line, that together, and how together we have slowed down the rate of attrition. It's a really steep downhill trend. But because of the concerted effort, there seemed to be a slowing down, or it has slowed down. Imagine if we have done a lot of that across the country. Wouldn't that be neat? Next slide, please. However, Marikina Watershed Initiative under this program seem to have lost steam too in recent years. Trees grow really, really slowly. Many stakeholders grew impatient and turned their attention to other things. In 2014, we tried very hard to convince the PDRF, or Marikina Watershed Initiative, to stay the course. Because if we stop, business as usual will kick in again. And by 2020, we said, we reckon that we would have lost, or we will lose 15,000 hectares in just 5 years. Next slide, please. And this, my friends, is where we are currently. If you can you go back one slide, please? This is 2014, and this is our prediction. Next slide, please. Back, please. Just to emphasize there that our predictive models were spot on. And we wonder why we face shortages in water in recent years, or feel very, very, very warm. Next slide. As a result of this further deforestation in Marikina watershed, most of the vulnerable species endemic to the country are now either rare or absent. Next, please. And the indicators of quality of water and extent of forest are rapidly disappearing too. Next, please. That's the kingfisher. And the indicators improving quality and extent of forest are almost gone, meaning we are facing really, really dire straits. We are in dire straits. So you can see here that biodiversity from our lens is our thermometer and barometer. They indicate the health of the planet. Next, please. Marikina watershed is a microcosm of the Philippines. As you can see here, our country suffers from problems relating to an impoverished, large, and rapidly increasing population, a gross loss of forest cover, especially at lower elevations, and many unsustainable land use practices. These factors has resulted to the Philippines supporting by far the largest number of critically endangered and endangered endemic species in any country in the world proportionate to its size. The correlation of the status of forests and our species are as clear as day. If you were a planetary health doctor, if you like, what will be your prognosis then? Next slide. And here, I'd like to show you the survival envelopes that we've mapped over the years. You see how the suitable habitats required for many of the unique biodiversity have contracted from 1994 to 2010 because of the massive land conversion that contribute to GHG emissions, thereby exacerbating the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Hence the vicious cycle, or what we call that syndrome or syndromic effect. This syndrome is happening. It is real. It may be eclipsed by the COVID pandemic, but the narrative of deterioration and contraction of survival envelopes of biodiversity and ultimately the humans as a species remain on the downhill trend, I'm afraid. Next, please. The Interplanetary Governmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has clearly put together a framework that underscores our relationship with nature and how we value or treat it has an impact on us. It shows the scope of from local to subnational to national to global. And central to the framework is biodiversity and ecosystems on the base there. What we do with them ultimately spell the quality of life, and in other words, spell planetary health. Next, please. In terms of policies, I think there's a basic flaw in the way economic development planning is being practiced in the Philippines. Our problem is that the economic sectors are measured by the contribution or their contributions to GDP. Those with larger contributions in terms of financial income and employment are considered priority in budgeting and public programming because they are seen to contribute to economic growth. And large-scale activities that employ hundreds and thousands of people like mining generate large profits, thereby paying their taxes to the government, are preferred over those that do not generate as much income and employment. Contribution of biodiversity and natural resources are measured only according to what they're being traded. For example, contribution of forests in terms of timber, contribution of water in terms of fish harvested, mineralized areas in terms of minerals, contribution of wildlife in terms of their traded value in the market. Meanwhile, ecosystem services are not being traded. Hence, are practically treated having zero or minimal values in GDP. Watershed protection functions, nutrient cycling, storm buffering, gene banking, all these functions of environment are not being traded, thus do not possess any market price. Because they are not contributing to conventional GDP, they're not prioritized in terms of public investments or public budgets of government. This low prioritization is further reflected in the signals being given to private sector. Tax subsidies are given to employment generating activities such as large-scale extraction. Use rights or long-term contracts are awarded to activities that generate higher financial income, which usually lead to higher public revenues. Government promotion packages usually target income and employment generation activities. All of these now are competing with conservation and sustainable management, as they are now being conducted in high biodiversity-rich areas. As private sector participation grows in activities that conflict with sustainable natural resource management, supply chains are increasingly degrading natural resources and ecosystem services further. Local community members who primarily depend on ecosystem services for their livelihoods are further driven below the poverty line, many of whom are forced to increase their harvesting of environment degrading activities without any consideration of sustainability beyond the short term. Either that or they are forced to trade their land use rights with immediate income of survival. Next, please. To illustrate this tension, I draw your attention to a series of ecological modeling that we have done to predict the suitable habitats of threatened endemic biodiversity in Mindanao. And this is looking at survival envelopes in 1988. It shows that pre-1980s, Mindanao offered a wide area of suitable habitats for biodiversity to survive. Next, please. And now you'll notice by 2010, we have seen a large contraction of the suitable habitats in just 3 decades. Much of these survival envelopes have receded in Eastern Mindanao corridor. Next, please. And incidentally, the Eastern Mindanao Biodiversity Corridor is also the timber corridor of the country. Can you see the red areas there? These are areas that have been deforested very recently. Next, please. And incidentally, this biodiversity corridor is also a hotspot for mining. In fact, every inch of it is under mining tenements now. Next slide, please. The new way of thinking, I think, is that we need to, because we're not valuing ecosystem services this way, there's no value there's more value for mining than value for ecosystem services. The deforestation is in Mindanao is perhaps the equivalent of between $60 to $120 million of assets in terms of carbon stock. If we prevent this annual deforestation, you know, you'll be surprised that the annual deforestation is equivalent to the size of 150 SMOAs. This is annually, my friends. Or if we prevent this annual deforestation in the next 25 years, it's equivalent to between 95 million to $1.9 billion worth of carbon emissions avoided. Next, please. Another example, and talking about a syndrome, let me illustrate the trajectory of forest loss and emission outlook for Palawan, the last frontier. Based on a recent analysis, the annual deforestation rate between 2007 and 2017 is around 13,000 hectares. This is the equivalent size of 303 SMO complexes being decimated across Palawan, or an equivalent annual emission of 1.6 million metric tons of CO2. Most of the endemic species, global endemic species in Palawan are lowland forest species. In the next 30 years, more than half of these species would have died off because most of their habitats would have been gone, as you can see on the right. By this time, Palawan would have had an accumulated emission of 48 million metric tons of CO2 if business as usual. Next slide, please. Right, in summary, and to simplify it, what we bring to the table is an appeal to government and us and future policymakers to reimagine and redesign the way we value biodiversity and natural capital, and everything that falls under it. Next, please. The health of our nation depends on the health of our natural capital. Next, please. And how we value natural systems. Next, please. And we pray for a public push for restorative and transparent governance. Next, please. To secure our futures. This is happening every so often now. Before, it's happening every 3 years. This is Ormoc. Now it's happening almost every other year now. And hopefully not every year. Next slide. If we do that, the challenge is for us to get together and to force our governments to create a safe space for biodiversity and people. Salamat po, magandang hapon.
Thank you po, Dr. Neil. And it is astounding to see, through the graphs that Dr. Neil presented, the direct correlation of biodiversity and population, as well as the way biodiversity pala is really an indicator of the health of our planet. We are also reminded of the great economic losses that we suffered and will continue to suffer because of natural disasters that we fail to prepare for if we remain business as usual. This is why, as mentioned by Dr. Neil, it is high time that we encourage our government to re-examine the parameters of our economic development planning, to emphasize now the importance of valuing not only productivity and contributions to GDP, but more importantly also ecosystem services. So knowing the importance of considering the environment now in long-term planning, as well as how it It is our first line of defense, even in a health pandemic. We will now hear from our next speaker, Dr. Mon San Pascual, who will discuss how we can address environmental degradation with insights from the health sector. Doc, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think I will ask our organizers to show my slides and I will go over it with their help. Now, I was tasked to provide the insights from the healthcare sector, and I'll start off. Healthcare as, is equivalent to healing. Hospitals is meant to heal sick people, just like the kind of crisis, the COVID crisis that we're having now. But let me speak about the impact of healthcare to climate change and how huge our carbon footprint emanating from the healthcare sector. Let's run the slide now. So I'll start by presenting a paper that came out in 2019. I'll just summarize what are the results and what are the recommendations. But just for people to realize how much damaging to our climate healthcare day-to-day operation. So this is a global survey, an estimate of healthcare climate footprint. And let me run you over to the next slide and on the summary results. So how huge? Healthcare climate footprint is equivalent to 4.4% of global net emissions. So if it is a country, the healthcare sector globally will be the 5th largest emitting country in the world. Now, in the next slide, you would see which are the countries that are among the biggest emitters, and I cite here particularly those that are in our region, apart from the United States. So this is the percentage contribution of the healthcare sectors in these countries in as far as emission is concerned. So if US is the biggest emitter, the healthcare sector, this is closely followed, for example, by Japan, South Korea, and other significant emitters in the region from the healthcare sector is China, India, Taiwan. You see at the bottom is 4.6, but it's close to already the emission level of Japan and South Korea. In the next slide, you would see where is it coming from? If the healthcare sector as a center of healing people is damaging our environment and climate, what are the sources of this carbon emission, therefore? And you would see in this slide that more than half of the healthcare footprint is determined by the kind of energy we use. And let me run you over to the next slide. What is exactly are these sources of carbon emission? Inside a typical hospital, and we're talking now about the healthcare as a formal sector composed of institutions such as huge, small, and medium-sized hospitals. The biggest contributor to climate change is a 71% there for the scope 3, which is the supply chain. This is not known to many, that supply chain in a hospital refers to everything that is consumed, like even cafeteria, you procure things to be served to the patients, and all these are being planted and being transported and cooked and afterward, food waste is generated. All this is part of the scope 3. Now, in the succeeding slide, it goes to the heart of the matter now. That in a hospital, the fossil fuel combustion is at the heart of healthcare climate footprint. Next slide. Therefore, the paper released almost a year, September 2019, and it can be downloaded from our own website. It concludes that, one, being a major emitter as a sector, the health sector has the responsibility to align actions and development trajectory with that of the Paris Agreement. Just like any other countries and sectors and institutions, the healthcare sector has a huge role to mitigate climate change. And the health sector also has the responsibility to carry out the very principle for which doctors have pledged to at the beginning of their profession. First, do no harm. And it applies to people, and it should also apply to the environment. In the next slide, we are already recommending, therefore, and these are now, what can healthcare do? What can hospitals, those that are treating us, those are where we bring our COVID patients at the moment of the pandemic, what can they do in terms of bringing about or slowing down climate change? It has to address its own climate footprint, one. Second, it has to support efforts of the society, whether the economic sector, the service sector, the agriculture, banking, trade, the transition towards clean and renewable energy in an active way, not in a passive, not in a slow-paced kind of intervention, but in a very determined, deliberate action of healthcare sector, the institutions, particularly hospitals and healthcare systems. Three, and we have a network of hospitals under the Global Green and Healthy Hospital group. And some of them have already committed to zero emission by 2050. That's the action 3 recommendation. For hospitals, especially the big healthcare systems, to go to the direction of zero emission by towards 2050, which is the global mark of zero emission. And fourth action, you would note these days, and this is coming from whether it's our Department of Finance, Duterte, or even our regular briefing, whether in the afternoon or in the noontime about COVID conditions, that we are getting resources, whether by foreign grant or we are borrowing or we are receiving donations. This is now where the healthcare can transform such contribution towards reducing the climate footprint of the sector. So we need to invest and advocate for decarbonization in an active manner, and then make the development assistance. Sorry, we need to move to the next slide. Yeah, make the development assistance for healthcare climate smart, just like how the big money that we are borrowing to support our climate response. Action 5 is to establish and implement government action plan for climate smart healthcare that will foster resilience, improve health outcome, and decarbonize the health system. And I think, particularly in Philippine setting, we are not a big emitting country, less than 1% of our contribution to the global emission. And yet, we are among the most vulnerable. We are in the top 3 of the most vulnerable country in terms of climate hazard. And therefore, the responsibility to go and inspire decarbonization is also upon us. And understanding it by with research on healthcare and climate change is critical. Now, how do we undertake this? And I'm now going to the next set of slides and talk about green hospitals. There is such thing. Hospitals do not just treat their patients. And I hope this would not surprise those who are participating in this webinar. But many of hospitals are aware that they need to facilitate healing of the environment. And we call this the green and healthy hospital, which is basically promoting both public health and reducing the environmental impact of the whole operation of the hospital. It recognizes that connection between human health and the previously presented slide on, for example, addressing forest loss. This is the role of green hospitals. Now, in that next slide, go ahead, shows the 10 goals that are guiding the network of global green and healthy hospitals, from leadership to addressing waste, water, building design, procurement, food, and maybe I can cite examples as we go along. Next slide. And it is a global network, and we are managing the Southeast Asia work of Healthcare Without Harm from our office in the Philippines, and you would see in this map the spread of the members in our region, Asia region. Now, just to give an example, this is where the action is. Let's cite plastic waste. Next slide. We are doing a lot on reducing the plastic waste footprint in hospitals. And we have come out with two materials so far. One is just an appreciation of how much plastic are generated. It's between 60 to 70% of a regular day-to-day hospital waste is composed of plastic. Unimaginable, but this is true. And yet, out of that study, we already come up with a toolkit on how doctors, nurses, the staff in the hospitals can be assisted in terms of addressing plastic in healthcare, from doing the audit, improving their waste management system, and other steps. Now, in this period of pandemic, we released a materials already on COVID waste. Can we move to the next slide, please? And this is an example of the poster educational material that we're distributing to hospitals, how COVID-19 waste can be treated properly without flooding more plastic into our environment. And then the next slide talks about the treatment options. One very clear message that we want people to understand is the easiest way to get rid of the virus is through soap and water or other forms of disinfectant. Therefore, burning waste that is COVID infected is an extreme action that is entirely unnecessary. And then the next slide talks about the necessity of going over your waste management system, the way it was already established and the way it's being run in hospitals, even without yet the pandemic, segregating waste at source, treating the coronavirus waste as any infectious waste. The protocols have been established even long before this pandemic. In the next slide, Para Bukas and our organization, Healthcare Without Harm, are both members of Population Health and Environment Network. And very much that's what we're talking about now is an approach to development where you integrate population health and environment perspective in one glance, not take it separately. So it talks about an approach that focuses on the connection of people, health, and their environment. Just like how much we take care of our home, why do we clean up our home, why do we maintain good health among our children? Because we realize that our family's health depends as well on what kind of environment, what kind of health measures we undertake in our own home. But society is not that. Society takes a silo approach to many things, segregating, just like what is mentioned a while ago, not doing much about forest conservation, for example. In the next slide, some of the goals of this PH in approach is food security has been tested in communities, poverty alleviation, balanced sustainable development, livelihood, and now resilience. Next slide. So in an ongoing webinar right now, there's a parallel webinar being hosted by PHE Network. It's been going on for the past 3 days now. There was a presentation of a project in Marikina that talks about adolescent reproductive health, the impact of climate, especially the risk from flooding along the barangays that are close to the Marikina River and the Nangka River. And there's also the integration of health into that whole small project. And we are initiating it Healthcare Without Harm, a typical PhD project. There was also a presentation of an hospital located in Tondo, providing maternal health, HIV/AIDS services, vaccination to children, at the same time ensuring that coronavirus is being attended to. So it links strongly the community organizations with that of hospital, thus building resilience in the hospitals, and as well gradually building a resilient healthcare services within the setting of the Mary Johnston Hospital. So these are the examples that illustrate this integration of environmental health, human health, and getting into the center the people themselves or the communities. And it can be done, it's being done. Now, my last 2 slides now, because Healthcare Without Harm does not only take waste as an issue, for example, or procurement as an issue inside hospitals, especially in the light of the very serious health crisis, which is the COVID-19. We want now to look forward to the whole issue of recovery. And this is a global work. And some of the impacts of the COVID-19 to the environment, to society, to the planet, to our healthcare system has been illustrated in the earlier slides. But again, I just want to highlight, for example, that air pollution has been an issue prior to the pandemic. But what has been the impact is that people with asthma and other lung concerns, health-wise, become more vulnerable to COVID. And yet those societies that are with less pollution, therefore are supposedly safer from COVID, especially those that are the seniors and the younger people. So that link once again. And then that pandemic, also the way we are going through now, you may notice we're still registering 3,000, 5,000, 4,000 daily cases. And more than half of this is in Metro Manila, the National Capital Region. And where are they taking place? In the most crowded communities. So inequality makes the impact of pandemic even more severe, but to the poorer of our people, the poorest sector, those living in squalid conditions, crowded, without toilet, without enough roofing, and not maybe even water or toilet. So that highlights now inequality driving further the adverse impact of the pandemic. And then the whole plastic waste issue generated by masks, visors, gloves, and the PPE. Now, the last slide, therefore, looking into the whole experience of PHE, of centering communities in the whole health and environment intervention, what do we do now moving forward in terms of sustainable recovery, just and healthy platform by which we can build better society, better healthcare system, better economy than what we had before the pandemic. These are the issues that when we talk about, when we had this consultation with our global partners in healthcare without harm, these are the common issues that are being raised moving forward. We need to address health inequity, the injustice of climate change, and the securing work. You would see the most dislocated people again are the poorest. And we will go back to that time and time again as long as inequity exists, whether society-wise, climate-wise, or health-wise. Health systems need strengthening, and you see this in our own DOH hospitals, in our own IT system, in whether it's the field health or now the DOH, where you cannot align the reported cases simply because of the so much delays every day. We need to strengthen even our human health resource. People do not want to work in the public hospital or even the private because they think working in abroad is better than working in a local hospital. Therefore, we need to offer better incentives, security of work, and security of their own health among healthcare workers if we want to strengthen the healthcare system itself. And therefore, even as we're talking about now about the link of environment and health, health in all policies therefore become critical. Now, climate action is a field where the healthcare sector must engage itself. And that includes renewable energy, WASH, the earlier lecture on forest and ecosystem. And what does it tell us, therefore? That doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, the ministries of health, our own Department of Health, they are critical messenger of change if they only appreciate the critical role in our society, including recovery of our environment. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and we hope to have some interactions in a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramon, for that insightful presentation.
And by the way, I'm not a doctor. I'm an MPH, but I'm not a doctor.
Thank you, Sir Ramon, for the insightful presentation. It was very interesting to realize that even environmental protection pala is included in the doctor's oath to do no harm, and how healthcare professionals are really could be messengers of change, even in the climate change fight. It is also encouraging to see how active the healthcare sector is in contributing to solutions to climate change, especially when we hear that even during COVID-19, they are encouraging environmentally friendly protocols. Another point for consideration for our policymakers, as Mr. Ramon mentioned, is to stop thinking about solutions in silos and to start taking more holistic approaches to the problems that we face now, especially when we consider that poverty is also very closely linked to health and to the environment. So for our final speaker today, we will be hearing from Attorney Theresa Tenazas on the different policies, plans, and responses of the government to illegal wildlife trade and the pandemic. Attorney Theresa, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. To my co-presenters, good afternoon, and to my brethren in the profession, good afternoon. So this is a really a great opportunity for BMB to be a part of this webinar and to do our communication, education, and public awareness campaign. And thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. So I'll proceed to my presentation. I've done this presentation in a very elementary or basic approach so that people can understand better biodiversity and wildlife. So to begin with, let me just proceed by giving you overview of Philippine biodiversity and what is biodiversity. Of course, biodiversity is the wealth of life forms on Earth encompassing all species of plants, animals, and microorganisms. Meaning to say, it refers to all variety of life that can be found on Earth, like plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms. So yeah, this was already mentioned by our distinguished colleague here, that Philippines is, yes, one of the mega biodiversity country, one of the 17 in fact, and we have at least 60 to 70% of the world's biodiversity. So why is biodiversity important? You know, biodiversity sustains our support system on Earth. It contributes to our environmental stability, and it provides options, both present and future, in terms of bioresources. So we go now to wildlife. Wildlife, as defined in Republic Act 9147, or otherwise known as Wildlife Act, refers to wild forms and varieties / strains of flora and fauna in all developmental stages, such as, but not limited to, eggs, pupae, seedlings, including those which are in captivity or being bred or propagated. Okay, so those wild flora and fauna not covered by any legally accepted instrument that is a product of registered captive breeding, propagation shall also be presumed to be coming from, is also presumed as a wild form. So we distinguish wildlife according to occurrence, okay? So when you say occurrence, what do we mean? We mean to say these are a category of wildlife that refers to being endemic, indigenous, or introduced, or exotic, migratory, and introduced. When we say endemic, these are species that are occurring and found only in the country, or for example, only found in the Philippines, like our Philippine eagle and tamaraw. They can be found only in the Philippines and nowhere else. When you say indigenous, they have established a population somewhere else in another country, not only in the Philippines, and like Nara. So Nara is not our endemic species, as maybe people are mistaken that it is. And when we say exotic, these species do not naturally occur in the country, and they can be found anywhere else. Well, to understand it better, they are foreign species. They are brought in the country, and that's why we have a lot of exotic species in the country. We also distinguish wildlife according to occurrence, like it's also a migratory species. When you say migratory, it's a seasonal visitor to the country. It's not ours. They come most in time when they needed to feed themselves, like birds from Siberia. They come from Russia, travel up to the Philippines. Normally happens during months of September. Okay. And there are also species that are introduced. These are species that have established population outside the natural range where man has brought them in, like the cane toad. So Chinese soft-shell turtle and hawksbill turtle are two of the examples of migratory species. So now we distinguish wildlife according to status. This is the most important part of the category of conservation status of wildlife. We distinguish wildlife according to critically endangered, and vulnerable. When you say critically endangered, it means subspecies or subspecies that is facing extremely high risk of extinction in the immediate future. And example of that is our blue-necked parrot. It's a critically endangered species. And when you say endangered, it means they are not yet critically endangered, but their survival in the wild is unlikely if casual factors are present. They will still operate. And when you say vulnerable, they are neither critically endangered nor endangered, but is still under threat from various factors throughout the range, and is likely to move to endangered category in the near future, with 10% chance of going extinct in 50 years. And so there are two more status: other threatened species and other wildlife species. Okay, just to give you an update of our national list of threatened Philippine fauna, we have at least 1,106 fauna in the Philippines. They are all endemic, and they are, you can see their categories. Okay, the national list of threatened Philippine plants. We have 984 endemic plants with their separate, different status of conservation. Now we proceed to Republic Act 9147, or otherwise known as Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. Okay, so what are the objectives of this law? First, it is to conserve and protect wildlife species and their habitats to promote ecological balance and enhance biological diversity. This is also intended to regulate collection and trade of wildlife. And of course, to maintain or pursue our international commitment, like our multilateral environmental agreements, which the Philippines is a member. And of course, to initiate or support scientific studies on conservation of biological diversity. So the scope and application of wildlife, it's provided for in Section 3 of the law. It's the law is enforceable for all wildlife species found in all areas, including protected area and their critical habitats. Also covers unknown genera or unknown species or strains of known species that will later on be discovered. It also applies to exotic or foreign species which are subject to trade and are maintained, cultured, or bred or propagated in a country, including those that have been illegally introduced. So, having said what are covered by Wildlife Act, so we now talk about which does not include, what are the species or animals that are not covered by Wildlife Act. So we refer to domesticated or propagated species. These are not regulated by wildlife, it belongs to another department. The common ornamental plants determined by DA or DNR upon recommendation of the National Wildlife Management Committee. And to tell you who has the jurisdiction in the implementation of Wildlife Act, actually there are 3 agencies that are mandated to implement Wildlife Act. One is the DNR. We do the exclusion here. These are the enumerations of terrestrial species that are under the jurisdiction of DNR, except for 2 marine species, which is the dugong and the marine turtle. Apart from this, if they are all terrestrial, it belongs to DNR. Then when we talk about marine species, all of this, the marine mammals, freshwater mammals, sea snakes, freshwater snakes, they are all belonging to DA, okay, or particularly the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. But when we speak, however, of both marine and terrestrial species that are belonging or within the jurisdiction of, within the Palawan province, they belong to Palawan Council for Sustainable Development. So we talk now about prohibited acts under RA 9147. Actually, RA 947 under Section 27 has 9 illegal acts, but I would only speak about the most commonly violated provisions of the law. And this is the following: Section 5, the trading of wildlife. And it covers an imprisonment ranging from 10 days to 4 years and a fine of 200 to 300,000. Another one, this is one of another provision of the law that is mostly violated, often violated: collecting, hunting, possessing wildlife, their byproducts and derivatives. So when we say regulation or when we say activities in Wildlife Act, this means to say that all of the activities covered by this law is given permits. So when you want to collect, when you want to possess, and you want to trade, this should be covered by wildlife permits, okay, to make everything legal. So when we talk about collection of wildlife, you have to get a wildlife collection permit. And the DNR or the BFAR or the PCSD give a quota, which is according to national quota, so that it will not be detrimental to the survival of the species. They use also acceptable and appropriate wildlife collection techniques. It could not be given to anyone who has no technical knowledge and financial capacity to do so. And only in the Wildlife Act has permitted or gave the indigenous people the authority or the permit to do traditional use, to collect only for traditional use, primarily only for, not for trade, and they can collect but not threatened species. Okay. So as the possession of wildlife, there is a permit that is covering that activity. And when you want to possess a wildlife, meaning plants or animals, you have to get a certificate of wildlife registration. And DNR can only register wildlife, meaning plants and animals, if they are supported by proof of legal acquisition. Other than that, the DNR cannot register any of your possessed wildlife, and when you possess any wildlife without any permit, that is illegal. Okay. And for local transport of wildlife, their byproducts and derivatives, it is also covered by local transport permit. So meaning to say, if you transport the wildlife without appropriate permit, it is also illegal. Okay. And once you transport wildlife, you also have to give the proof of legal acquisition or receipt coming from any of the authorized facilities where you bought the wildlife. And for a special local transport permit, it pertains to a permit or a special permit that is given to a person or an authorized agency or facility that can do the shows, exhibition, and educational purposes. This is a special permit that's being conferred to wildlife special use permittee, authorizing the conveyance of wildlife byproducts, and other derivatives for that purpose. So we now go to the exportation and importation of wildlife. This is very important. We all know that we do international importation, exportation, and re-exportation. And the agency or the convention that regulates the international trade of wild flora and fauna is known as CITES. So I will explain that to you later on, but I was just trying to tell you that the Philippines is a member country of CITES. That's why all our international trade should be governed by this convention, and we should seek permit coming from, when it is a cited listed species, meaning plants, both plants and animals, we should go to Biodiversity Management Bureau. We are the ones issuing the permit, processing the permit. If it is non-cited, then it belongs to all the regional directors around the country, depending on where the species, is the location of the species. And for commercial breeding or propagation of wildlife resources, it is also permitted, provided that you have a wildlife farm permit for breeding for commercial purposes, meaning to say you can breed, you can propagate, you can also engage in trade. And but you have to have a wildlife farm permit, which can be secured from our regional offices in the Philippines. And you should also get, this is a permit that can only be given to those who have a special, the capacity to do so. Again, someone or a facility that has a person who has the knowledge, the technical knowledge to propagate or to breed, and you have financial capacity. And of course, the most important one is that you have the facility to do the breeding and propagation, okay? And then when you want to collect wildlife, okay, it is also allowed except only for the purpose of conservation and enhancement of population. You are not, generally, you are not allowed to do collection. But if you already have a wildlife farm permit, meaning to say you are allowed to do so, but the species or the stocks that you have in your facility are also coming from a registered facility. Normally species under Appendix 2 of the convention, or the Convention on International Trade on Endangered Species of Wildlife, Flora, and Fauna. Those are species that are normally covered by the wildlife farm permit, and those you can collect or you can possess within your facility. As regards wildlife collectors permit, as I have said, you cannot collect seedlings or plants and animals from the wild. It's not allowed, but only for conservation and enhancement of population. And okay, this I have already mentioned this. And there are points to remember, of course, that I was saying only the I haven't said it, but you have to remember that only the registered progenies or those included in the list of economically important species shall be used for commercial purposes, meaning to say not the mother stock, only the progenies. And for local trade or transfer, exchange of registered non-threatened fauna species shall be allowed, provided that such sale exchange is registered with the nearest DNR office. And for transfer of threatened species, it may be allowed, but only to the direct family member or members within the third degree of affinity or consanguinity, and provided that they shall also be registered in DNR at the DNR offices. And in the absence of relatives, a holder of CWR or the Certificate of Wildlife Registration can also transfer it to another holder of CWR and no one else. And via a donation, not for sale, no sale, no other disposition except only through donation. Okay. Now we go to CITES. Okay. Any other trade of wildlife without the permissible permits or the allowable permits given by DENR as mandated by CITES are all illegal. Okay, any activities, any import, export, re-export, bringing out of a species in and out of the country will be illegal without these permits. So how does it work? It is an international agreement between governments which aims to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. So that is the main purpose of that. And the Philippines has been a member of that since November 16, 1981. And we, as of now, we have about 183 member states. Okay. So, as I have said earlier, CITES works like this. They categorize a species according to appendices, okay? Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3. When you say Appendix 1, they are categorized as species threatened with extinction. When you say Appendix 2, they are species not threatened with extinction, but trade must be controlled to avoid their becoming threatened. And those under Appendix 3, are those species for which a country is asking parties to help with its protection. So, like normally in international convention, we do our position and we try to encourage other member countries to support our position that we wanted a certain species to be protected. They are neither under Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, but we fear that in the future they'll be threatened. So we actually write or do our position, write the CITES, and do our position paper and support our stand why we wanted this species to be threatened, to be protected. Okay. And as I was saying earlier, there are two jurisdictions that gives permit for CITES and non-CITES. For CITES, you can go to, for CITES listed species, you should go to BMB. So we are the ones who are going to process your permits. You can import, you can export, and you can re-export all those allowable species under Appendix 2. Okay. And with, of course, with supporting documents, okay? And for non-CITES, you can go to different regional offices where your species are, and you can also apply, and provided you comply with also the requirements. So we now go to the role of DNR in preventing emergence of zoonotic diseases and pandemics. Okay, we all know that illegal wildlife trade has a relation with the emerging zoonotic diseases like the COVID-19, and it has been established that it came from bots and emanated from the country, from Wuhan, China, from the Republic of China. And it was established that because of wildlife trade, both live and dead animals, the handling of this species made possible of the transmission of these zoonotic diseases, or otherwise known as zoonosis diseases. Okay. So what are zoonotic diseases? Actually, in simple terms, they are germs that transmit from between animals and humans. So because the diseases, animals are normally carrier of these diseases, and because of improper handling, they have this, the transmission is really high. And actually, science-based studies said that 75% of all emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. And emerging pathogens are more likely to be viruses other than kinds of pathogen like bacteria, parasites, fungi, and more likely to have a broad host range. And as I said, the interaction of humans and or livestock with wildlife exposes them to the risk of spillover of potential pathogens. This is explaining that since animals, you know, they interact with one another, like bots coming to pangolin, but it's not yet established, but that the zoonotic, this COVID-19 came from bots transferred by pangolin, or pangolin transferred by bots to humans. But it is already established by different scientific studies that bots have transmitted viruses or zoonotic diseases to humans, like the Rift Valley fever, the Zika virus diseases, the Ebola, bird flu, no, bird is not, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, and of course the COVID-19. Okay, so why do we want to have an ecosystem that is resilient and has can cover, that a healthy ecosystem actually rather means a healthy habitat and a healthy environment. And when we say, because of the emergence and re-emergence of zoonotic diseases are closely interlinked with health of ecosystem. So as I was saying, when environment is healthy, of course, the ecosystem and the biodiversity are all resilient and healthy, and they can sustain life. And of course, we can prevent the emergence of another zoonotic disease like COVID-19. And human-induced environmental changes modify wildlife population structure and reduce biodiversity, resulting in new environmental conditions that favor particular hosts, vectors, and or pathogens. Yes, it's correct. And the intact ecosystems serve as barriers to wildlife, human livestock interaction, thereby reducing the risk of wild virus spillover. Okay, so you know, when we don't disturb our habitats and our wildlife, they don't interact with people. And by assuring that limitation of interaction, the possibility of non-emergence of COVID-19 and other more zoonotic diseases is highly likely. And ecosystem integrity can help reduce diseases by supporting a diversity of species so that it's more difficult for one pathogen to spill over, amplify, or dominate. It only goes to show that we should prevent wildlife trade, illegal wildlife trade, so that the diversity of a species will remain in our in the wild, and it will not it will regulate the diseases. Okay, and what do we do to prevent the emergence of zoonotic diseases and pandemics in the future? Okay, so we have a One Health approach, of course. Like human health, nowadays we prevent to prevent the spread of further spread of the virus, or at least to curb the increase of sick people. We prevent non-essential travels, and of course we do also we protect the animal health by preventing the cross-boundary trade to service the demand of wildlife. That's why there is a wildlife traffic monitoring units in every ports and seaports of the country, so that we can prevent the illegal trafficking of wildlife. And so of course we can also maintain the animal health and the spread of virus. And for environmental health, we should protect our bats as their natural reservoir. We should no human consumption of bats. We should remember that bats also play an important role in our ecosystem. They pollinate our fruits, and they serve as our and without that, they are interconnected. One ecosystem is interconnected with another ecosystem. We just think that bats are, stinky, but in fact they help pollinate and they have a service in our ecosystem. And this is as to policies. Of course, we continuously protect wildlife and its habitats by continuous and stringent implementation of Wildlife Act and the NIPAS Act, which is the law that mandates protection of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem and the wildlife thriving in their habitats. And of course, we do the regular monitoring, patrolling of protected areas and key biodiversity areas. This is in a way preventing the damage of the ecosystem and the biodiversity, and of course to refrain people from disturbing wildlife and doing the illegal activities that is prohibited under the Wildlife Act. And we do also the promotion of various area-based conservation measures by establishing more local conservation areas. And like what the local governments do, they do their own initiative by establishing or issuing an ordinance establishing a particular area as a marine protected area, or a seascape or landscape, and so forth and so on. And we do also try to engage our local communities in our conservation initiatives. And we have this policy that the most to be benefited of these resources are the locals, because they live there. So we try to engage them so that the protection is there, as well as sustaining the biodiversity. As to regular wildlife disease surveillance, we also do that we enhance the knowledge and capability and an understanding of people as to the causes and relationship of emerging infectious diseases to human and to wildlife, illegal wildlife trade, and also the disease monitoring to improve early warning systems. So these are all what the Biodiversity Management Bureau is doing right now to at least to address the problems in zoonotic diseases. And I hope to get the participation of people that you don't engage in illegal wallet trade nor patronize people selling and trading, and follow the law. That would be all for Biodiversity Management Bureau, and thank you for listening.
Thank you po, Attorney Theresa, for that presentation. It's good to know and see that the Philippine government is highly regulating biodiversity trade, especially if we consider that zoonotic disease can spread through wildlife trade, as mentioned by Dr. Andrea earlier in her presentation. We also see how human interaction to wildlife could really increase our exposure to zoonotic disease that may, of course, lead to potential pandemics. Before we move on to the question and answer part of the webinar, we would just like to post that the form for the certificates is now in the chat box for the participants who would like a certificate, and as well as we will be sending copies of the presentations to everyone today through the emails that you used to register for this webinar. So we have a few questions for our speakers through the chat box earlier. For Dr. Monica Ortiz, in the Philippines, given that resources are limited and the economy is going down, do you think that government will also give attention to or prioritize the environment? Alternatively, will there be more government support for NGOs and other environmental groups?
I think I'm talking, yes. Thank you for your question. It's a very important one. Are resources limited, and will we get support otherwise if resources are limited? I think it's a difficult and challenging question to answer. We don't know, for example, where government funds are being allocated very specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. It would be interesting to note how if, for example, international or ODA, overseas development assistance, will also be decreased as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, emphasizing that governments might stop these channels of finances to rechannel them into internal allocations. So it remains to be seen. Obviously, there are many things that we can do as advocates for change, or as advocates for these changes within our policy, to rally around available sources of funding, to make noise around where we think our finances should be going. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. For Dr. Aldrin Mallari and Mr. Mon San Pascual, there is a question posed to both speakers. What are your recommendations for how the Philippine government should plan for COVID recovery, given the considerations that you presented earlier?
Sir Monica muna.
Sige. It's quite unfortunate that because of the extreme or severe impact of COVID to our country, and we haven't even gone out of the first wave. If you notice, we're still dealing with the first wave, where other countries are already dealing with the second or third wave. But due to the impact of COVID, there seems to be not much discussion, at least at the government level, on how recovery can take place. I am part of a consulting group that already prepared a climate smart and resilient health facility development plan meant for our DOH, and it's been sent to them maybe 2 months or so ago. But they don't just have the time to deal with it, and yet this is the kind of report that is very critical in this time of pandemic. But certainly it should be centered on healthcare system, one. Secondly, recovery should talk about moving away from fossil fuel energy Third, that any discussion on recovery should center on communities, whether it is their health, their economy, the societal setup. And fourth, any discussion on healthcare recovery should talk about building up capacity, both of the healthcare system and of the economy itself. One that is resilient, that one that is climate responsive, and one that is sustainable. So these are guidance principles, but I do hope that whether it's NEDA, whether it is the Department of Health itself, discussion should already begin on recovery on a post-COVID setting within our own government. Thank you.
And to add to that, I think work is underway to craft a law. I mean, this is headed by Senator Legarda, Congresswoman Legarda, on following a green or blue development pathway post-COVID. I think that's and we're involved in rethinking and reimagining our economic recovery in using a planetary health platform. That's great. Many of the bilaterals are still recognizing the importance of ecosystem services and biodiversity in the path to recovery, and so lots of investments there. The caveat, of course, is that sorry, this might be paano nga ba sabihin yun? We always say that there are a lot of policies in government, etc. But it seems that the big societal gap is we have lots of policies, but we will always fail in the implementation. For example, if we talk about collaborative management and conservation using based on the principle of plurality, that's a protected area system. But how come we're still failing to meet our IC targets, for example? It's not the laws, it's not the policies. I think it's we lack the skill sets. When we all go back to our own offices, we all fight our own battles. And as said earlier on, we are siloed. And in the realm of natural resources, there's a marked, you can see the synchronous planning. For example, as Attorney Tenazas explained, when we talk about wildlife, divided yan into ecosystems. Yung reptiles mo nasa DA, yung mammals mo, some are in the sea, under DA, some are in DNR. But because natural resources don't have these political boundaries, or even geopolitical boundaries. So I think that's a challenge. Marami na yung ingredients na nandyan, pero that would be post-COVID situation, perhaps, is underscoring that call now, that more than ever, think biodiversity conservation is not about the cute and cuddly animals, but they are our survival, planetary health ang pinag-uusapan natin, species survival envelopes and human survival envelopes. Salamat po.
Thank you po to our two speakers for their answers. Our next question po is for Attorney Theresa. It has been said that one of the ways zoonotic disease is spread globally is through wildlife trade. How has the Philippine government considered this risk as we recover from COVID and also as we try to prevent another pandemic? Is there increased regulation like additional testing of wildlife? How is this also considered in curbing illegal trade?
Uh, Thank you for the question. Is rather long, so let me just answer the first one. She she asked about what. Can you repeat the question, please? By the first question.
Yes, attorney, the first question is, how has the Philippine government considered the risk of zoonotic disease being spread globally through wildlife trade as we recover from COVID and also as we try to prevent another pandemic?
Yes, the the DENR in particular acknowledged that part of the problem of illegal wildlife trade is the presence of zoonotic diseases in these animals being trafficked. That's why during the ECQ, the secretary issued a memorandum stopping or suspending the trade of wildlife and other forest products so that it will somehow prevent the further spread of zoonotic diseases in the country. And as to illegal wildlife trade, of course, we also issued a memorandum to all our regional offices that they should strengthen or ignite their surveillance and monitoring in our seaports and airports so that there will be no illegal trade of wildlife coming in and out of the country, especially so when China issued a policy. I think that it was through law issue saying that they have stopped stopped trade of animals in their country, but except some animals. So it has we were warned that the Philippines might be one of the target countries that might be the source of the wildlife that the country or their domestic law or domestic source cannot provide for domestic use of their people. And the second question is?
You answered na actually, attorney,
Okay.
there is just a question on, is there increased regulation like additional testing of wildlife?
As to additional testing of wildlife, we don't have it here in Biodiversity Management Bureau. Only we do have the DNA testing only, but actually the Committee on Zoonotic Diseases is already in place way back, and one of our strategy to prevent or at least do the surveillance is to increase the surveillance, of zoonotic diseases, so that in the future we can already inform our national government of if there are already existing zoonotic diseases again, like COVID-19, which came to us by surprise, of course, because we were informed too late. But as to testing, it's one part of our programs for next year. We already proposed that to NEDA and to our work and financial plan to increase our budget. We will include the testing and the surveillance and monitoring of zoonotic diseases.
Thank you po for your answer, Attorney Theresa. As a closing question po for all our speakers, are there feasible steps that ordinary citizens can take to reduce their carbon footprint and also to reverse the years of damage to the environment? Or is this something that should be done by governments and large corporations? Anyone po can start? Thank you.
I can start if that's okay. I think that's a very important question. It's like we always are looking towards the government for guidance, and I think Attorney Teresa's presentation about what the policies are good, and her recommendation to follow the law are also very important. So we should support the policies that we have, and as Dr. Mallari said, to implement them effectively is another question. But for what we can do as people to support reducing our carbon footprint and our biodiversity footprint, I would add as well, is to be conscious of the products that we are consuming and the products that we are demanding, to know where they are coming from, to know what impacts they have, and to know the sustainability of the choices that we make in our day-to-day life. We're focused right now on COVID-19 as a wildlife pandemic, but for example, the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 was from a pig farm in North America. So it's not just, we have to be conscious of the way that we consume food, for example. And so looking at the whole system is important to understanding where we as people can reduce our carbon and biodiversity footprint. Thank you.
I'd like to add something to that. I suppose we as citizens should be demanding for sort of deforestation-free commodities. For example, commodities that we usually buy. For example, you know, there was a study that came out in early 2000 on the global environmental apathy. And in that study, it was saying, are people just not aware? But the study showed that the people are aware. But the big barrier for people not to take the green development pathway is that it hurts to do that. For example, it's easier and cheaper to buy cheaper cooking oil from palm oil plantations, but they're not deforestation-free commodities. So following that path of doing no harm and, you know, what they call it, demand for commodities that reduce the carbon footprint and are more restorative in nature. So I think that is what we can do as citizens. Salamat.
Yeah, if I can comment on the question. This pandemic already forced us to change behaviors and do things differently. For example, going to our offices, doing our work and becoming productive, and yet remaining at home. So you can imagine how much carbon reduction each of us have already contributed by not using our cars or taking public transportation, not eating out in a McDo or in restaurants, and working from home as well. If you do notice, reduce our waste footprint in many ways. Although there are some arguments that we are now ordering more delivered food packages, but we are also cooking more from home. So what I'm referring to now is that if we come to think of it, and we really want to address carbon emission and slowing down climate change, we are already doing it in this time of the pandemic. So anything that we do from here on, we should already keep up the good things that we realize are doable and yet keep us productive and keep us engaged as society, and do more. Less car, more biking, more online meetings rather than physical meetings, and yet get the work done. Less travel via plane, and yet we're able to reach out to our international colleagues. So these are great examples of how much we can change behaviors and therefore be able to reduce our both carbon and environmental footprint as well. Thank you.
Is it my turn to answer? Okay. right?
Yes, attorney, go
All
ahead.
right, okay. Well, coming from an environmental insight, of course, I would advocate the reduce, reuse, recycle, refuse, rot, of course. That is one of the ways to prevent carbon footprint. Of course, I cannot say don't travel, but refrain from traveling. Of course, our colleague Mr. Pascual said, San Pascual already mentioned that we must stay at home, well, to prevent transmission of diseases, COVID-19, and of course, to reduce carbon emission. We can also use the naturally produced products from our farmers. And of course, we use, yeah, like I mentioned, we refuse to use the single-use plastic and be more environmentally oriented and conscious. So I think that would be all from my part. Thank you.
Thank you po, Attorney Theresa, and all the other speakers for your answers. So before po we end the webinar, and I would like to thank again our presenters today for such informative presentations and really driving home the point that all of this is connected and that we should not forget about the considerations that we have always been taught about even before COVID-19. So before we end our webinar, may I please request lang everyone to turn on their videos because we will take a photo. Please turn on our videos. Yan. Okay, who will take the photo? Nine? Okay, Niner will take the photo.
So there are 5 pages of screen caps. So hold lang po natin ang smiles natin. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Next. 1, 2, 3. Next. 1, 2, 3. Next. 1, 2, 3. And last. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nine, and thank you, everyone, our participants who joined us today. And of course, as mentioned, the speakers that shared their insights and their time with us. So just thank you also to our organizers, the UPIILS, as well as Parabucas for organizing this informative session this afternoon. As mentioned, this is only, this will be a series, so just watch out through Parabucas and IILS page for any updates on more informative sessions like today. Thank you, everyone, and keep safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Salamat.
Po, salamat.
Salamat po.
Maybe, end na lang kaya i-end na natin yung meeting.
Sorry?
Let's end. I-end natin yung meeting na para
Yes, pwede. Stop recording first.
Ah, yeah.